Good afternoon. I'm Peter Saltonspelt, President and CEO of NORD, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. We're fortunate to have key leaders from both the FDA and CDC with us today to talk about the COVID-19 vaccines and various considerations for the rare disease community. I'd also like to take a moment to thank both the CDC and FDA for all their hard work over the last year to get us to the point now where we have vaccines available that are hopefully leading us to a point where things can start to resume some semblance of what I guess we all call normal, getting back together with one another. So before we start, though, I'd also like to spend just a second to say a special thank you to our partners who helped us put this on today. And that's the ALS Foundation, that's also Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and the Muscular Dystrophy Organization. So without their help, none of this would be happening today. So without further ado, I would like to kick it over to Dr. Ed Nealon, NORD's new Chief Scientific and Medical Officer, to run the program today. So hope you all find it enjoyable and helpful. And yes, there will be time for questions. Ed?
Thank you, Peter. This past January, NORD, the ALS Association, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and the MDA got together to host FDA and CDC leaders discussing COVID-19 vaccines, safety, questions to ask one's physicians, and vaccine rollout plans. We are here today with the same partners to continue that conversation now that COVID-19 vaccines are available and vaccination numbers are rising, while COVID-19 case numbers are falling. We are thrilled to have this opportunity to get answers to our most pressing new questions directly from those most in the know at the FDA and the CDC. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers, and I will turn it over to each of them for brief opening remarks. We are privileged to have with us today Dr. Janet Woodcock, Acting Commissioner of the FDA, Dr. Anne Schuchat, Principal Deputy Director at the CDC, Dr. Peter Marks, Director of CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at the FDA, and Dr. Sarah Oliver, Lead of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, COVID-19 Vaccine Work Group at the CDC. So let's start with opening remarks from Dr. Woodcock.
Thank you very much for bringing us together to continue this conversation. You know, I've worked with the rare disease community for a very long time, and it has a special place in my heart. I understand the concerns about vaccines, and I really look forward to discussion and answering any questions. As an agency focused on science to protect and promote the health of the public, the FDA has been engaged in combating the pandemic for well over a year now, and we've come a long way since our last discussion with you in January, especially in the vaccine space. But I recognize it's been a difficult path for those living with a rare disease, as they may be among the more vulnerable to COVID-19. At the FDA, we've been working since the earliest days to advance a far-reaching response, putting enormous resources and tools to work in our search for solutions. And we continue at the same time to apply rigorous science and good data. And we're really committed to be as transparent as possible about the scientific basis for emergency use authorizations in order to promote public confidence in our scientific review process and ultimately in feeling comfortable using the authorized products. We've held a number of vaccine advisory committees that have been public for emergency use authorizations, and we have another one coming up to discuss pediatric considerations. The advisory committee is external experts who review clinical data from both submissions and provide their own recommendations. And as you will hear, the CDC also has public advisory committees, so there's plenty of opportunity for public discussion and input. As each vaccine EUA is considered, our FDA career scientists conduct a fast but very thorough review of the complex request. We look at manufacturing and quality control data, as well as safety data and effectiveness data and so forth. Our career scientists and our staff have worked around the clock, including holidays, weekends, and late nights to get this out to really respond to the need. Additionally, we also provide updated information to help healthcare providers understand the benefits and the risks and proper use of FDA-authorized vaccines, including fact sheets for healthcare providers and recipients, instructions for use, and we also do letters of authorization for the sponsors, which spells out the conditions that the vaccines can be used under. It's really essential the public and the public health professionals, as well as practitioners, have full trust in our review process, complete confidence in whatever products we approve or authorize, and faith in the FDA and our commitment to public health. This confidence is particularly important as we continue on the national vaccination campaign to get broader community protection. Each of you working with or living with rare diseases can play an important role in this regard. Your understanding of our process, which you have had for quite some time, how it can support innovation, and how the FDA applies the best science and data to help us make well-informed decisions can go a long way to helping boost public understanding and confidence in the FDA and the products we authorize or approve.
Thank you very much, Dr. Woodcock. We'll turn next to Dr. Schuchat from the CDC for opening comments.
Thank you so much for the chance to be part of this discussion today. Our nation has been through so much this past year with this very, very challenging pandemic, and more than 33 million people reported to have been infected. Nearly 600,000 people have passed away. The patients and loved ones and caregivers of people with rare disorders have had a very challenging time. And although many of you are used to not having the answers to the questions you need, this has been a particularly challenging period. We know that COVID can cause more severe disease, and including fatal infections, more often in the elderly and in people with particular medical conditions like diabetes and heart disease and neurologic conditions. But for people with very rare conditions, we may not have all the answers that you need. The good news is that the US is now experiencing significant improvements in infections, in hospitalizations, and in deaths. And much of that is due to the extraordinarily effective and safe vaccines that are now being widely used. The outlook for people with rare disorders is good because of both reduced transmission around the country from our social distancing efforts, as well as our vaccines, and from the direct effects that the vaccines can have for those who are eligible. Right now, everyone in the country 12 years and up is eligible for vaccination, and there's plenty of supply. And we recommend the vaccine strongly to all people over age 12 for both direct protection and to reduce the chances that you will spread to others. I'm looking forward to answering the questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schuchat. Our next speaker to give opening comments is Dr. Peter Marks.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me today. I think one of the questions that often comes up now is, we're getting to a place where it's so important to get a very high percentage of the population vaccinated. And questions come up about, how did we manage to get these vaccines to people so quickly? And I think what's really important to make sure people understand is that there were no corners cut in the development of these vaccines. What was done was simply time that would have been spent between clinical trials was eliminated, and time that would have been spent waiting for trials to complete to advance manufacturing scale-up was eliminated. So it's true that these vaccines were developed in the current 2 mRNA vaccines and the Janssen adenoviral vector vaccines, the 3 emergency use authorized vaccines were all developed in under a year and studied, they were studied in clinical trials that were the size of those that we normally use for approving vaccines. Now, granted, we don't have the normal 6 to 12 months of safety follow-up for these vaccines, but we do have the efficacy data, and we do have very good ongoing surveillance of those who participated in the trials, plus safety surveillance conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and by FDA on those who have received the vaccine, who now number in the hundreds of millions. And so that combined gives us a really a good sense that these are vaccines that have a safety profile that's quite favorable in this setting of COVID-19, such that we hope that people will take these vaccines knowing that there's no shortcuts and that this is really our ticket to getting back to life to normal in the coming months.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marks. Our fourth speaker today, Dr. Sarah Oliver, will give the next opening comments.
Thanks so much, and thank you for the opportunity to join. In December of 2020, the United States had 250,000 COVID cases per day and over 300,000 deaths per day. Since then, ACIP has met to review the safety and efficacy data of 3 vaccines authorized by the FDA under an EUA. We now have recommendations for use of these 3 vaccines, the Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson vaccine. With more than 300 million doses delivered, COVID-19 rates are now down to 15,000 cases per day and 300 deaths per day. As of June 6th, 51.5% of the population has received at least 1 dose of a vaccine, and 42% of the population is fully vaccinated. All of this is fantastic news, but we're not done yet. Community engagement opportunities with honest discussions around vaccines is how we'll improve vaccination rates and expedite our return to normalcy. And on a personal note, as someone with a close family member with cystic fibrosis, I understand the concerns for those with rare diseases, and we'll continue to work together to address these ongoing questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oliver. What an amazing group of 4 panelists to talk about the topic of the day. As we move into the Q&A section, I want to note that we have collated the questions that we received from the audience during the registration process and have worked with our partner organizations to collect the most common questions that they have been hearing about the COVID vaccines and special considerations within their respective rare disease communities. I've tried to place these questions into groups, and we'll spend a little time on each group of questions so as to make the best use of the experts we have today. The most common questions we received were about patients who are immunocompromised, and that might be because they have a rare immune deficiency, or they've received an organ transplant or cancer therapy or some other medication that has impaired their immune system. So I think the first question is really about the data and should go to the FDA. And that question is, what information do you have on how effective vaccines are for patients who are immunocompromised, including data on adults or any early data on the pediatric population?
This is Peter Marks. I can start on this, and that's to say that the vaccines were not studied in individuals with true immunocompromise. There were individuals with diabetes, other comorbidities that were studied in reasonable numbers. So we don't have data from studies at this point that have been completed in immunocompromised individuals. There are studies ongoing in various different immunocompromised populations, and there are some data that have appeared in the literature on individuals, for instance, who are undergoing cancer chemotherapy or therapy for autoimmune diseases who have been vaccinated. There is some indication that there can be a decrease in the immune response, but I think and I'll pass this over to my CDC colleagues to comment on, I think the party line here is that while we wait for additional trials to be conducted, it's still the better part of valor to get vaccinated, because some protection, be it even if it's not to the same higher levels of antibodies, if you're immunocompromised, is better than no protection. And we'll hopefully have the data soon.
And maybe I can just add a few comments and see if Dr. Oliver would like to supplement them. You know, we know that following natural infection with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, individuals who are immunocompromised may take a longer time to clear the virus, at least as we've studied through specimen testing for the polymerase chain reaction. And it may be that they don't make as good an immune response to that natural infection, and that may carry over into the vaccination. But we think that vaccines are beneficial and safe in immunocompromised individuals, and that when others, you know, as we heard earlier, the higher proportion of the community and the population and one's loved ones that are vaccinated, the less likely they are to spread virus to each of us. And so immunocompromised individuals can both be protected, at least partially, through direct vaccination, and then protected by having their loved ones and their neighbors be vaccinated as well.
Thanks, and this is Sarah Oliver. I can just add that this is something that's been discussed as well, and so we look forward to reviewing, ACIP kind of broadly looks forward to reviewing additional data around vaccine studies in immunocompromised populations. And so if or when kind of updates may be needed to vaccine policy, we'll have those public discussions reviewing the data, and any recommendations would be made after a public discussion. But we're aware that this is a question that's continually being asked.
Well, thank you very much to the panel. We also received questions from immunocompromised patients, not directly related to the vaccine, but related to other precautions that they could take. So let me put this question back to our colleagues from the CDC and ask, what precautions should individuals who are immunocompromised or have received an solid organ transplant be taking to protect themselves? When will it be safe to lift those precautions for individuals who are immunocompromised, whether or not they've been vaccinated?
You know, let me just say generally that it's always a good time it's always a good idea to speak with your own clinician, your healthcare provider who knows you and your circumstances, because of course individuals with a particular disease can have very large differences in their individual risks and activities. But we do think that people who are at higher risk of severe outcomes from COVID-19, for whom the vaccine may not have provided as much direct protection, may want to take precautions about large gatherings, about not wearing a mask when they're around lots of people that they are concerned about, and that they may want to really make sure that the people around them are vaccinated. We think that the amount of transmission going on right now in the United States is much less than a few months ago, but we are still having thousands of cases a day and sadly hundreds of deaths each day. And so until we reach a better stage of reduced transmission, particularly in the community that you live in, that idea of being exposed to lots of other people in crowded circumstances with poor ventilation, without masks, might be risky.
Thank you very much. In a related area, we received questions about how will patients who are immunocompromised know whether or not their vaccination has been effective? So these questions included, Do we have effective tests that we can use to see if antibodies are actually produced in immunocompromised patients? And at some point, will there be an approved titer test for COVID-19 vaccination as there is for some other vaccines? And I might just leave this to the speaker who feels best positioned to address that.
We're all jumping at the chance to answer this question, right? Peter, it looked like you were about to.
Go ahead, Anne, please.
You know, what I would say is that it's not appropriate right now to have a false sense of security for an antibody test. We think that the immune protection against this virus is complex and probably multifactorial, and we don't yet have a correlate of protection. Scientists really want to have a correlate of protection, so we have that black and white situation of I'm protected, like I know I am against measles, or I'm not protected and I need to, get another vaccine or make sure that I take precautions. We're not there yet in terms of the science. There are antibody tests, and I'll let my colleagues from FDA talk about them, but our issue is that the absence of an antibody doesn't mean you're not protected, and the presence of an antibody on various tests might not mean that you're okay. But let me let my colleagues from FDA go into this in greater detail.
Thanks, Anne. I think you summarized things really well. The problem right now are that there are tests that could say, yes, no, you have an antibody, but they're not going to tell you accurately enough what that level of antibodies is. And as Dr. Schuchat already mentioned, we don't know what the exact correlative protection is. And even if we did, and it was antibodies, the current tests that are often in use are not accurate enough in reliably saying what that number is, so that you could get a sense of false confidence. So I think where we are right now is that getting vaccinated, good thing to do. That with taking extra precautions is probably the right thing to do at this point in time, until we have the correlates of protection and or these tests nailed down, because the last thing we want to do is give anyone a false sense of security by a test that says a number or not. The other thing is it can be very confusing. Some people have gone to get tests to see if they've developed immunity to COVID-19, and they're told they're not immune. And it's because they've been given the wrong test. They've been given the test that looks for an antigen that's only present, something that's only there if you've been exposed to the natural virus. So that's happened a couple times, and I'm sure it's happened more than I know about. So we would suggest, I think, just exactly as Dr. Schuchat suggested, which is, get vaccinated and take the extra precautions. That's probably the right thing to do, rather than rely on a test that could give you faulty information.
Right.
Go ahead, Dr. Woodcock.
Yeah, sure. I just chime in that currently our Center for Devices doesn't recommend using any of the tests, all right, that are currently on the market for the purpose of seeing if a vaccine worked or something like that, because they really aren't designed for that. And so, as Peter said, it could provide a false sense of security or a false result. So right now, get vaccinated.
One thing I wanted to add, I think individuals are really trying to figure out, what can I do and what should I be worried about doing, and what kind of information can help me feel more confident about doing things, or feel sure that I better continue to take extra precautions. And one thing is getting vaccinated and hoping that you've gotten a good response to the vaccine. But the other thing is knowing what's going on around you. And there is information at most local and state health departments about the level of transmission in your area. And CDC, at our website, cdc.gov, we have a data tracker that can hone in on your county and give you a sense of what's going on there, because it's quite variable around the country in terms of both the level of vaccination, much higher in the Northeast right now than in the Southeast, for instance. That gives you a certain sense of confidence that there's more vaccination around me. That's a good thing. And also about the level of transmission and how much there are ongoing cases being recognized in my community. Those two local factors can help you in addition to knowing that, you've been vaccinated and those people that you're around are vaccinated. One of the reasons we have so much caution around travel and large gatherings is you're more likely to be exposed to people from other places than your own community in those environments. And so that's why we're trying to just heighten that awareness if you are immunosuppressed or if you're not yet vaccinated, about those other settings being potentially riskier ones.
Well, thank you, panel. I think collectively you really did an excellent job answering the questions that our immunocompromised patients have put forward, recognizing where in some cases we just don't know the full answer yet. I'm going to turn now to another group of questions over about the next 10 minutes that focus on other kinds of rare disorders or sometimes specific organ systems. So one of those questions is, are patients with clotting disorders such as ITP or patients with more common clotting problems like DVT at more risk of developing side effects after getting the COVID vaccine?
So this is Peter Marks. I'm going to take the liberty of taking that one since I'm a hematologist by training. Despite the fact that there has been some concern in these areas, there are a lot of blood clots with COVID-19, and blood clots are remarkably common to begin with. There's, right now, the suggestion that there's any real concern, particularly after the pause that was taken with the Janssen vaccine for people with blood clots or immune thrombocytopenia to get the vaccines. I think there's no evidence that you should not get vaccinated. In fact, all the evidence, quite to the contrary, is that the risk-benefit is still far in favor of getting vaccinated. We don't have anything to suggest that, for instance, with the Janssen vaccine, that there was anything about a hypercoagulable state, something that causes one to clot, that was made one more likely to have the very rare adverse events. So bottom line right now, most important thing is to get vaccinated to prevent from getting the adverse effects of COVID-19, because about 1 in 6 people who get COVID-19 end up with some type of blood clot. If you prevent that COVID-19, you prevent that problem as well.
Thank you. Moving into another area, some patients with rare skin or muscle diseases have special concerns about injection site injuries. Are there any alternative methods of administration or any plans to develop other vaccines or therapeutics on the horizon?
So I can start on that one, which is that right now the vaccines are given with a very skinny intramuscular injection. The needles that are used are quite small. Right now they are intramuscular injections. Those people who have bleeding disorders should just make sure they let the vaccinator know. For instance, people with hemophilia are often told to take their factor replacement the day before they go to get vaccinated. But to be perfectly honest, the needles that are being used would probably be, for most bleeding disorders, perfectly fine, even without factor replacement. But again, check with your healthcare provider before you get vaccinated. So I think that they're not a lot to be concerned about. There are people I know who are needle phobic. There are other methods that are being looked at, but they're further behind. And I think for this particular part of the pandemic, we're not going to get those. We're not going to see those put into use. Maybe in the future, but at least not. I don't see them on the near horizon helping us to end this this particular pandemic. So unfortunately, I think we're stuck right now with the current needles that are being used to give an intramuscular injection.
Maybe I could. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go
I was just going to say, I was just going to sort of supplement a little bit of what Dr. Marks mentioned about the concerns with needles, because that is fairly common, that people think, well, there's going to be something better, right? Can't I just wait? I do want to introduce a sense of urgency that we're seeing in other parts of the world. New strains of the virus emerge that are potentially very contagious, perhaps even more transmissible than what we're dealing with, and that may have that the vaccines that we have right now may be less protective against. And so we're continuing to be in this race against the virus. The more people we get vaccinated in the United States, the more protected we are against new variants emerging here. And so again, it's not the time to wait for that needle-free vaccine that may be a couple years out. This is a really important time for everyone to get vaccinated and get all their friends and neighbors and loved ones to step up and get vaccinated because of that ability to reduce the risk that variants will emerge and to truly protect the most vulnerable among us, whom, the young children who can't be vaccinated yet and so forth.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to pile on to what Dr. Schuchat just said, because if I had to think about what keeps me up at night, it's a graphic of the vaccination rates in parts of the United States where the rates are not anywhere near close to 70%. In fact, they're significantly below 50% in a belt of the country towards the south. And that is opening ourselves up to a very dangerous situation where we could have one of these more transmissible variants move through the population and create real havoc after the fact. The time to deal with this is right now. It's very easy right now to think that, wow, we're ahead in the race, we're opening up and it looks good, we're getting back to bars, restaurants, etc. Don't worry about getting vaccinated, we'll deal with it later. But think of it this way, when you're in the lead in a race and you're coming towards the finish line, you don't slow down, you don't even go at the same pace. You run even faster because you never know who's coming up behind you. And I think that's the attitude we need to take with vaccination here. We really need to get to the finish line here, which will be really eliminating the susceptibility of our population as much as we can, knowing that there are some individuals who can't be vaccinated at this time, such as the younger children.
Yes, and to that point, or people who may not respond well to vaccines, we are working on therapeutics. They're being studied now that are oral antivirals against coronavirus. And so that would, of course, the vaccines are the ultimate solution to new respiratory viruses like this. However, as we see with influenza, we still get some breakthroughs. We still get people who get sick. And we hope to have oral antivirals at some point. FDA just authorized the Regeneron monoclonal antibody cocktail to be given as subcutaneous infusion. And so that won't help for people who are concerned about skin problems and muscle problems, but in fact, it may be more convenient and quicker way to treat people who get infections for one reason or another. Doesn't mean, though, none of these things mean that vaccination is not the foundation. It is.
Well, thank you very much to everyone who commented on that topic. Dr. Woodcock, you have anticipated another question that was later in the sequence, which was, what about other therapies that might be coming for patients who might not find the vaccines effective or proven in their group? I think you covered the topic pretty well, but would you or any of the other panelists like to add to the topic of COVID treatments as opposed to vaccines, since we've now touched on it?
Well, I'll just say that obviously the greatest objective is to find an active oral antiviral that is non-toxic, that can be used in outpatients when they get sick, to keep the disease from progressing, prevent hospitalization and further progression. So a lot of drugs are being studied in that setting. Clearly, there are a number of antibodies that can do this. It's simply a matter of getting them into the patients, and that's where the subcutaneous administration may be in advance for the monoclonal antibodies. For later stages of the disease, we haven't made huge strides, I think, since dexamethasone. Now we have remdesivir, dexamethasone, and a number of immunomodulatory agents for people who actually get in the hospital to try to prevent them from progressing further. But there are many trials going on, and hopefully we'll have more information coming out at some point. So we, for those people who get the disease and don't respond to early treatment or are unable to get it and have to go in the hospital, that we can treat them more effectively.
Great. And another question that we came close to a minute ago is the following. Given that some rare disease patients fear that vaccine may not be effective for them, some have asked, do you as experts think that we will reach herd immunity and that will provide protection to these vulnerable populations indirectly?
You know, we don't think that there's an on-off switch with a certain percent of the population that is vaccinated that will turn this pandemic off. We do think the more people that are vaccinated, the less spread and the less risk of variants emerging. But as Dr. Mark said, it's really a race to get as many people vaccinated as possible. And I think something that I was surprised about was how well these initial vaccines worked in some of our frailest population. You know, usually we have vaccines that work in adults and children, but in the frail elderly, they don't work at all, or they're very minimally effective. It was incredible to me how highly effective the mRNA vaccines were in the long-term care facility population. There's a number of studies now of real-world use in very elderly individuals that found that were, you know, not living at home anymore, that found high efficacy after 2 doses after the complete series, and even pretty good efficacy after just between the first and second dose. And so I'm very encouraged that that direct protection is quite good for most of the population, and that we just need to increase the numbers. I know the community of individuals and organizations around rare diseases has an incredible history of advocacy and partnership and networking. And this is the time to pull out all the stops and challenges to your groups and your networks to get the word out, help us answer the questions people have about the vaccines, their safety and their efficacy, and the real risk that this virus has for each of us and our families. So I think that the herd immunity, elusive holy grail is not what I'd go for right now. I'd go for direct immunity because it is so good from this vaccine. Yes, we have data now that people who are vaccinated are less likely to spread, but we don't have a magic number or a magic model that tells us if we hit this percentage. We're really going to try to get to the July 4th target, but it's not an on-off switch. With it's really the more the better.
Yes, if I could I add to that? I think for those who are immunocompromised and who are concerned that their response to the vaccine has not been, might not be adequate and they might be exposed, keep in mind that you can be administered a monoclonal antibody and then get antibodies, that you would have neutralizing antibodies then should you get sick. So if you or a loved one were to get ill after being vaccinated and would come down with COVID and has a comorbidity, one way to prevent progression is to get a monoclonal antibody that boosts your resistance to the virus and decreases progression. So I think we'll always need the safety net with this virus. It's not like herd immunity would prevent everyone from never getting this virus again. And those amongst us who are more vulnerable should get vaccinated, but then don't forget, you have another safety net behind that if you were to get sick anyway.
Well, thank you. I think those comments about the availability of monoclonal antibody therapies and good responses in elderly patients should be very encouraging to folks. Thank you for that. I want to direct one question, I guess, to Dr. Oliver, specific to the sort of the use of the vaccine and how it compares to other vaccines. We got two very similar questions. One was, and I'll read them together. One was, please address the risks of the COVID vaccine in terms of triggering various neurological diseases. How does the COVID vaccine compare to the flu vaccine, for example? Or if you're a patient who's already been diagnosed with something like Guillain-Barré syndrome, should they get a COVID-19 vaccine?
Okay, thanks for those questions. I'll start with that question by saying these vaccines have been shown in the clinical trials to be incredibly safe and incredibly effective. We're continuing vaccine safety and monitoring for what happens as these vaccines are rolled out in hundreds of millions of populations of people. This remains a top priority, across the government with CDC and with FDA. So we continue to monitor these through these, our vaccine safety surveillance systems. So we'll continue to monitor over, the lifespan of these vaccines. To date, they really have been shown as we have gone. We've seen that they've been safe. So we've not had specific neurologic concerns. I think people watched as we had kind of the clotting concerns, the TTS that Dr. Marks was alluding to. When that happened, we kind of immediately, CDC, ACIP, FDA, everybody came together. We presented that data publicly, discussed it, and then figured out what we would do moving forward with the vaccine recommendations. So if anything were to happen, I would say there's not been specific concerns for kind of broad neurologic events. But if anything happens, that would absolutely be brought forward and discussed. Then specifically around people who may have had a history of Guillain-Barré syndrome, those individuals may absolutely choose to, or can absolutely get a COVID vaccine. Again, if there's a medical issue that would make them at risk for having complications from COVID, that's exactly the type of people that we would recommend get a COVID vaccine. I also want to highlight that we have a document. So there is a clinical considerations website on CDC's, the cdc.gov. It's called Clinical Considerations, and it's linked to in all of the MMWRs that have talked about the vaccine policy. That really walks through several of the populations that people have asked about. So there's a section in there on individuals who have a history of clotting disorders. There's actually a section on there with if you've had a history of Guillain-Barré. So I think if individuals who are participating in the webinar think, oh, I can't remember what was the answer to that, going to that clinical considerations website, they're able to kind of walk through and kind of in the future can reference some of those other recommendations. But individuals who've had neurologic conditions or have had Guillain-Barré absolutely can get a COVID vaccine.
Thank you. Another group of questions we have specifically concern children, and in part this is because, as you know, the vaccines aren't yet approved for children at younger ages. So we receive questions like, parents of children with a rare disease are concerned that they will put their children at risk if they go back to work or go out socially. What activities are safe, and what should be avoided? How can a family of a person, a child with a rare disease, keep that child safe during this time?
Right. So maybe I can start just to say that if you're a parent of a child who's you're concerned about and you're directly vaccinated, you are very highly protected against the virus, and it's very unlikely that you can spread it. So that fear of going back to work that, everybody had at the beginning of the pandemic. We do believe that getting vaccinated really protects you from both getting the virus and then, inadvertently picking it up and spreading it to someone else. So we think that's important. If you feel more comfortable wearing a mask, even though we've said fully vaccinated people don't need to in most circumstances, it's absolutely fine to wear a mask. We're not telling people they have to rip off their masks, but we do think that that going out and about is okay then for the caregivers and parents. The FDA experts may want to comment on the studies that are ongoing for vaccines for children under the age of 12, but I think at this time, we do think that that fully vaccinated people should be able to circulate without fear of spreading the virus to those they love.
Thanks.
Yeah,
It would be great to...
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say that we still will have to wait for several months before we have the younger children data. But I just would completely agree with what Dr. Shook had said, that really, although we don't know that the vaccines don't absolutely prevent spread necessarily, but they certainly, from all the data we have, indicates that it certainly very, very significantly reduces it. And so I think that exactly as Dr. Shook had said, people should feel free to move about. And if it makes you feel better to wear a mask, when you're moving about, particularly in high risk situations, indoor situations, I think you have to do what makes you feel comfortable and that you can live with. And nobody should make you feel ashamed of wearing a mask. After all, you might not be vaccinated. It's what makes you feel comfortable.
And I think we've really been impressed with how effective masks are. I think some of us are thinking every flu season we're pulling out our masks again because they were so incredibly effective against other respiratory viruses. So there should be no stigma or shame related to that. And of course, everybody wants to do all they can for their loved ones.
Yeah. They didn't do bad against seasonal allergies as well for some of us, right, too.
Well, thank you very much. We have made it through most of our questions that were focused right on rare diseases, but of course, our patients also have some questions of a more general nature. So that brings me to the question of what's the science saying now about the need for booster shots?
So I can start on that one. It is clear that over time, the people who have been enrolled in the clinical trials where we continue to follow their antibody levels, those antibody levels trail off with time. They don't decline very quickly, but they are declining over time. Now, this goes back to something that Dr. Shook had said. We're not sure whether those antibodies are the absolute immune correlative protection. In other words, you could still be protected even with lower antibody levels, but to a first approximation now, we're using those as a way of figuring out when boosters might be necessary. It's not clear whether boosters will be necessary. It's possible that they'll be necessary after a year. It's not certain. And some of this, though, may depend not just on how immunity wanes in individuals, but also by what variants we have circulating. Because we know that for some of the variants, having very high antibody levels seems to correlate with the ability to fight off those infection with those variants. So if it turns out that we have a set of nastier variants circulating, that might affect kind of the timing of when boosters might be recommended. But it's still too early to know for sure, definitely when they might be needed. Dr. Shook, do you anything else you want to comment on that one?
It's a tricky issue because we really don't know yet if they're going to be needed, and
right.
There are a lot of factors to consider. I know that the scientific data are being reviewed, and we're engaging our expert committees to think about this issue. But I also want to just say that it's quite different for companies or researchers to look into the booster question from a decision to go ahead with them. And I know that many who are, real anxious about making sure you're protected ongoing in the future, particularly those with the rare conditions, we're trying to get to the science so that we can get the best information. And if there's a need for boosters, of course, we'd want to be ready with that. So it's, again, like many months ago, dealing with uncertainty and trying to be prepared, but not trying to jump the gun on need. Right now, our main focus is getting more and more people vaccinated and preventing the emergence of those variants and getting to as low a level as we can here in the US, while we, of course, support the work around the world to protect people everywhere.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are at the hour and are out of time. So I want to reiterate our very heartfelt appreciation to all of our speakers for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us here for this very important conversation. We deeply appreciate your time here today and your hard work on behalf of the rare disease community and the country overall. NORD would also like to thank our partner organizations for helping us put on this event, the ALS Association, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and the Muscular Dystrophy Association. Have a great rest of your day. We hope to see you again soon at another NORD event, such as the Living Rare, Living Stronger NORD Patient and Family Forum, including the Rare Impact Awards, which will be held virtually June 26th through the 28th. Thank you.